society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall never surrender.
Good day, everybody. This is UCY.tv with the Solvinur Event. Check out the website at UCY.tv, and if you mouse over shows, there's a whole bunch of shows that you can follow. If you click on any of them, you can also check out the past radio that has been done there. So if you find an interesting host, you can always check out what else he has made in the past. At UCY.tv there's also a link to a chat. If you go there, I can try to answer any questions that may come up. It doesn't have to be on topic. And there's already some people there. Let's see, who's already in the chat? Del, Jules, Rode, Vince, Hans, Cap, and Tuanon. Welcome, everybody. It's a beautiful day here in the Netherlands, where it's just past 4 p.m. We've had lots of sun. Good for my strawberries in the garden. And even the trees are looking good that I planted last year. Apple and pear, so we'll see what happens to that in September or so. For today, we have a continuation of The Most Dangerous Superstition by Larkin Rose. Yeah, we still got quite a while to go. I doubt we will finish it today. So let's get started with this, right? Even the most heinous examples of man's inhumanity to man, committed in the name of authority, rarely persuade anyone to question the idea of authority per se. Instead, it leads them only to oppose a particular set of tyrants. As a discouraging example, much of the most fervent resistance to the Nazis came from the communists, which is quite strange in itself, right? I mean, the Nazis are far left on the political spectrum, same as the communists. You would think that they, like each other. Who by themselves advocated a form of oppression just as vicious and destructive as Hitler's regime. Due to their authoritarian mindset, the Germans had no chance to achieve peace or justice, as their entire national debate was concerned only with which kind of all-powerful rulers should be in charge, without even a hint at the possibility that no one should have such power. The public discourse has been similar throughout most of the world, throughout most of the time, focusing on who should rule instead of questioning whether there should be rulers at all. yeah, I would add to that it's not to normal people like you and me, you know, who focus on who should rule. That good morning, Hopper. That is usually done by instances. I don't know if you call them instances. This reminds me of World of Warcraft, you know, the game that I play, but there you have instances. Looking for the right word here. Entities is probably a better word, like the CFR or the ECFR. Alright, and that brings us to the next heading. No, Hans, no aesthetic penance today. Yeah. This, you guys really want to hear about the Mahabharata and the Indian myths, don't ya? Yeah. Nope, not today. Maybe in 3 weeks or so. Next heading is a mix of wisdom and insanity. In the late 18th century, something very unusual occurred, something that seemed as if it might break the perpetual cycle of serial tyrants. That event was the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Yeah. John Locke comes to mind as an influential philosopher in this regard. What made that event unusual was not that the people were rebelling against the tyrant, which had happened countless times before. Okay, Vince. Try and get a little bit bigger letters, because I can hardly read those tiny things. Not rebelling against the tyrant, which had happened countless times before, but that the rebels expressed some basic philosophical principles, rejecting not just a particular regime, but rejecting oppression in principle, almost. Yeah. Dive into John Locke for more of those basic philosophical principles. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which followed some years later, were a combination of profound insight and glaring contradictions. Oh? Really? What contradictions is he talking about? On the bright side, the discussion of the time was not just about who would be in charge, but focused heavily on the concept of individual rights. Yeah, John Locke. And limiting the power of government. At the same time, the Declaration of Independence erroneously asserted that government can have a legitimate role in society to protect the rights of individuals. However, this has never been true in practice and cannot even be true in theory. As explained above, an organization which did nothing more than defend individual rights would not be government in any sense of the term. The Declaration also spoke of unalienable rights, which I'm not sure if that should be inalienable, but whatever. And asserted that all men are created equal as far as their rights are concerned. But the authors failed to realize that such concepts completely rule out any possibility of a legitimate ruling class. Yeah. So there's the contradiction, right? If you all have the same rights, then there can be no ruling class, right? Even a very limited one. The very principles they expressed were then immediately contradicted by their efforts to create a protector government. Correct. One day they were declaring that all men are created equal. Yeah, I have a problem with that whole sentence, by the way. What do you mean created? Men are not created, men are born. And the next they were, not the next day, but as in tomorrow, it says here they, as in them, but that sentence doesn't make sense. And the next day were declaring that some men, calling themselves Congress, had the right to rob, tax everyone else. U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. It's probably say, and then next, right? The American Revolution was the result of a hodgepodge of conflicting ideas. Born from creation? What the heck is that, Vince? Born from creation. To create something is to produce something, right? It sounds to me that is artificial, right? You create an axe, or you create a car, or whatever. You don't create humans. It sounds like a test tube baby, We are born, not created. Don't confuse the two terms. And then if you say born from creation, I have no clue what you mean with that. The American Revolution was the result of a hodgepodge of conflicting ideas. Creation of what, Vince? You say a product of creation. Creation of what? Some supporting individuals, some supporting individual sovereignty, some supporting a ruling class. The Declaration asserts that when any government becomes destructive of individual rights, as every government always does, the moment it comes into existence, the people have a duty to alter or abolish it. Yet the Constitution claims to give the Congress the power to suppress insurrections. Yes. Anon says created in the womb. Well, but those are not men. You don't create men in wombs. Anyway, continuing here. U.S. Constitution. Hold on. Yes, somebody's asking me in check website and Skype here. Yes, I'm level-headed. It's probably a good description you could give. But if you come with reasonable arguments, I'm always, willing to change my point of view, change my ideas. So, okay. There we go. Come on. Okay, you got it. Somebody got it. Somebody got how to get to the chat room. Alright, fantastic. Yet the Constitution claims to give the Congress the power to suppress insurrections. Oh, it does? Oh, that's not a contradiction then. I thought it was militia that was supposed to do that. U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 is that. This implies that the people have a right to resist government oppression, but that the government has a right to violently crush them when they do. In short, the works of the Founding Fathers consist of a combination of profound wisdom and utter lunacy. In some places, they described quite well the concept of self-ownership. In others, they sought to create a ruling class. They did not seem to notice that these two agendas are utterly incompatible with each other. Yes. The result of their effort was, in one sense, a gigantic failure. The regime they created grew far beyond what both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists said they wanted. The Declaration and the Constitution utterly failed to keep government power limited. The promise of a government that would be a servant of the people, protecting their rights but otherwise leaving them in peace, grew into the largest, most powerful authoritarian empire the world has ever known, including the largest and most intrusive extortion racket ever known, the largest and most powerful war machine in history, and the most intrusive and invasive bureaucracy in history. In truth, the idea was doomed from the beginning. Perhaps the most valuable thing the Great American Experiment accomplished was to demonstrate that limited government is impossible. There cannot be a master who answers to his slaves. There cannot be a lord who serves his subjects. There cannot be a ruler who is both above the people and subordinate to them. Unfortunately, there are still many who refuse to learn this lesson, insisting instead that the Constitution did not fail. The people failed by not doing it right. Oh, welcome, Winter. How you doing, buddy? By not being vigilant enough, or by some other neglect or corruption. Oddly, the same excuse given by communists for why their flawed philosophy, when put into practice in the real world, always turns into violent oppression. The truth is that any form of authoritarian control, any type of government, whether constitutional, democratic, socialist, fascist, or anything else, will result in a set of masters forcibly oppressing a group of slaves. This is what authority is, all it ever has been, and all it ever could be, no matter how many layers of euphemisms and pleasant rhetoric are used in an attempt to hide it. And this brings us to the next heading, which is the contract myth. The mythology surrounding the Constitution alleges that it served as a sort of contract between the people in general and their new servants in Congress. But there is not a shred of truth to that. One cannot, by signing a contract, bind someone else to an agreement. Right? Because you didn't sign it, right? The idea that a few dozen white, male, wealthy landowners could enter an agreement on behalf of over 2 million people is absurd. But the absurdity does not stop there. No contract can ever create a right held by none of the participants, which is all what government constitutions pretend to do. The form of the document makes it clear that it was not an actual contract, but an attempt to fabricate out of thin air the right to rule, however limited it was supposed to be. An actual agreement by contract is fundamentally different thing from any document purporting to create a government. For example, if 1,000 American colonists had signed an agreement saying, "We agree to give 1/10 of whatever we produce in exchange for the protection services of the George Washington Protection Company," they could be morally bound by such an agreement. Making an agreement and breaching it is a form of theft, akin to going to a store and taking something without paying for it. But they could not bind anyone else to the agreement, nor could they use such an agreement to give the George Washington Protection Company the right to start robbing or otherwise controlling people who had nothing to do with the contract. Additionally, while the Constitution pretends to authorize Congress to do various things, it does not actually require Congress to do anything. Who in their right mind... I'm sorry, I got distracted by something outside. Where were we? Who in their right mind would sign a contract which did not bind the other party to do anything? In the Cheney versus Winnebago 489 US 189, even the US Supreme Court officially declared that the government had no actual duty to protect the public. The result is that the Constitution, rather than being a brilliant, useful, valid contract, was an insane attempt by a handful of men to unilaterally subject millions of other people to the control of a machine of aggression in exchange for no guarantee of anything. The fact that millions of constitutionalists are desperately trying to get back to that in the hopes that it can save their country if the people try it again, after it completely failed on the first attempt, is a testament to the power and the insanity of the superstition of authority. And this brings us to part 4. Life without superstition. Next heading is the solution. Nearly everyone can see at least some problems with the government he lives under, whether it be corruption, warmongering, socialist redistribution, police state intrusions, and other oppressions. And many are desperate to find a solution to such problems, so they vote for this or that candidate, support this or that political movement or party, lobby for or against this or that legislation, and almost always end up disappointed with the results. They can easily identify and complain about various problems, but an actual solution always eludes them. The reason they are always disappointed is because the problem does not reside in the people called government. It resides in the minds of their victims. This is a very important point here that he makes. If people were not as mind-controlled as they are, government would have no force at all. Tinkering with government cannot fix a problem that does not come from government. The dissatisfied voter fails to realize that it is his own view of reality, his own belief in authority, that is the root cause of most of society's problems. He believes that a ruling class is a natural, necessary, beneficial part of human society, and so all of his efforts focus on bickering over who should be in charge, and on what the power of government should be used for. When he thinks of solutions, he thinks inside the box of statism. As a result, he is powerless from the beginning. Begging masters to be nice or asking for a new master never leads to freedom. Instead, such behaviors are dear indicators that the person is not even free inside his own mind. And the man whose mind is not free will never be free in body. People are so accustomed to engaging in the cult rituals collectively referred to as politics, right? So like voting, lobbying, petitioning, campaigning, etc., that any suggestion they not bother. There's probably a typo again in this sentence. I can't correct it so fast, so I'll read it as it is, that any suggestion, the exclamation mark, they not bother participating in such pointless and impotent endeavors amounts, I, dot, comma, their eyes, it's probably in their eyes, to suggesting that they do nothing. Alright, I can't make head or tails of this sentence, I'm sorry about that, it's probably a typo. Because they view voting, whining and begging as the entire spectrum of possibilities open to them when it comes to government. They are unable to even comprehend anything that might actually accomplish freedom. So when a voluntarist or anarchist explains both the problem and the way out of it, but without presenting a new candidate to vote for, a new political party to support, or some new movement or campaign to get behind, in other words, without proposing anything that coincides with the superstition of government and authority, the average statist will complain that no solutions were offered. From their perspective, anyone who does not play the game of politics within the rules set down by the ruling class is doing nothing. They enthusiastically declare, you have to participate. They fail to realize that participating in the game created and controlled by tyrants is doing nothing. Nothing useful, at least. In turn, yes, Hans, in Dutch that would be onvervreemdbaar, which means you can't steal it from a person. In truth, rather than some event needing to occur or some particular thing needing to be done, the real solution, the only solution to the problems involving government, comes from not doing certain things and from certain things not happening. In one sense, there is no positive, active solution to government. The ultimate solution is negative and passive. Stop advocating aggression against your neighbors. Stop engaging in let's get that straight, right? When he says stop advocating aggression against your neighbors, it means stop voting, right? Don't let politicians steal from your neighbors, right? That's advocating aggression against your neighbors. Stop engaging in rituals that condone the initiation of violence and reinforce the notion that some people have the right to rule. That's again, vote, to vote. Stop thinking and speaking and acting in ways that reinforce the myth that normal people should be and must be beholden to some master, and should obey such a master rather than follow their own consciences. When people stop bowing at the altar of government, stop playing the games of tyrants, stop respecting arbitrary rules written by megalomaniacs, the problem will go away on its own. Being a mythical entity, authority does not need to be overthrown or voted out or reformed. The people need only stop imagining something that is not there and never was. If the people stopped allowing an irrational superstition to warp their perceptions, blah, 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 blah. Again, like I said last week, your perceptions are not warped. It's your interpretations of what you perceive that is warped, all right? Their actions would immediately and dramatically improve. Most aggression, which is now done in the name of authority, would cease. No one would issue commands, enforce commands, or feel an obligation to obey commands, unless the commands themselves were seen as inherently justified based upon the situation, not based upon the one giving the command or his supposed authority. that alone would eliminate the vast majority of theft, extortion, intimidation, harassment, coercion, terrorism, assault and murder which human beings now perpetrate against one another. When the people recognize and accept no master, they will have no master. Ultimately, their bondage and the means to escape it exists entirely in their own minds. That is very true. Human society does not need anything added to it to fix most of its problems. Nor does it need the institution, that was probably the word I was looking for when I said instance, of some new system or the implementation of some new master plan. Instead, it needs to have a one thing, all-pervasive, extremely destructive thing removed from society. The belief in authority and government. What will make things work is not any centralized plan, not any authoritarian agenda, but the mutually voluntary interaction of many individuals, each serving his own values and following his own conscience. Right, this is very much like the ethics of an objectivist philosopher. And you should serve your own values. They call it selfishness, or to be selfish, right? But they don't mean selfish as the bad name that it has now. It just means serve your own values, right? It's the opposite of altruism. And in fact, altruism is a very destructive and evil notion. Why is that? I'll try and explain that. You know, altruism says that, well, you should do everything for somebody else, right? So, who are you to tell me that I should do things for somebody else? That makes everybody a slave, you understand? But the mutually voluntary interaction of many individuals, each serving his own values and following his own conscience. Of course, this does not fit at all with the way almost everyone was trained to think. Right? That's an important one again. We are not educated in how to think. We are trained in what to think. Right? That society needs a master plan with leaders who will make it happen. In truth, what society needs the most is the complete lack of a master plan and the complete absence of authoritarian leaders to whom the people must surrender their free will and judgment. The solution is not to add something new to society, but simply to understand and dispel the most dangerous superstition. Next heading is called Reality is Anarchy. Many people, Anon asks, isn't this form of training also? Well, Anon, I don't know if you've followed any of my previous events, and I tried to teach you what the trivium is, right? You should always apply that what you have learned from what the trivium is to whatever you hear, including what you hear from me, right? And what I'm reading from Anon is a PDF that you can freely get on the internet. It's called The Most Dangerous Superstition, Larkin Rose. Alright? So by Larkin Rose, and it's called The Most Dangerous Superstition. Right, so it's the trivium that teaches you how to think, right? Not what to think. And it's the trivium that teaches you how to spot contradictions, which will, if you accept contradictions, your mind is not functioning as it should. And it leads to illusions, right? So my aim is not to get the people to act. I've said that many times before. The best thing, I think, for people to do is to do nothing. Seriously. I mean, if we all just did nothing for a while, the whole thing would collapse. And that's where we can start over and get rid of this insane reality that is being pushed upon us. Right? So I'm not training anybody to do anything. Well, maybe except think for yourself. Yeah. But that's not really acting in society, right? That's just for yourself. So if you've never heard of the trivium, you start Googling, go to triviumeducation.com, get yourself acquainted with all of the stuff that's available there. It will take months and months before you get even through only that website, and there's much more. Alright, so check it out. You can also check out YouTube, type in Solvinur, 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 and Trivium, and you will see Gino Denning there and Jan Irvin, and they give very good explanation, much better than I can, of what the trivium is. Why is it important that you learn the trivium? It's important because the trivium is like a mirror of how your mind works, right? So it goes back to what the Grecians said, ancient Greece, know thyself, right? If you don't know how your mind works, you are easily mind controlled, you understand? So that's why it's important you know what the trivium is. It's a weapon against mind control. Continuing, many people have become anarchists, advocates of a society without any ruling class, after having come to the conclusion that society would be more prosperous and more peaceful and would enjoy more justice and security without any government at all. Anon says, thank you, Walter. I agree people need to stop thinking in a state of unawareness. Perhaps then, or our ancestors would have called that living in ignorance too. Yes. Stop thinking in a state of unawareness. I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around that. State of unawareness. This sounds like sleep, right? Yeah. Alright, Anon. However, that is somewhat akin to an individual deciding, after careful analysis, that Christmas would work better without Santa Claus. But if Santa Claus is not real, it is pointless to have a debate about whether he is needed in order for Christmas to work. If Christmas works at all, it already works without Santa. And so it is with the usual debate between government and anarchy. Government does not exist, it never has and never will, which can be proven using logic that does not at all depend upon any individual's morals belief. All right. My idea is why he says that government does not exist and it can be proven using logic is because it's full of contradictions, right? So why can it then not exist? Because in nature there are no contradictions. In reality, there are no contradictions, right? Spell capital R, reality. To quickly rehash, people cannot delegate rights they do not have, right? So that's a very important one. How can it be that when you vote for some politician, he all of a sudden has powers that you never had? Right? That's insane. That doesn't make any sense. Comma, which makes it impossible for anyone to acquire the right to rule. People cannot alter morality. People cannot alter morality. All right, like I said last week, this is rather important. Morality comes from ethics. Ethics is a branch of philosophy. Some philosophers I heard say there is no other thing besides ethics to philosophy. Well, I tend to disagree with that. But for anyone to have ethics or a morality, you must have, like I said last week, a metaphysical view and an epistemological view. Right? Metaphysics means what is the nature of reality? Epistemology means how do you know what you know? From those two, you get a ethics. From those two, you get your morality. Right? I'll give you a fast example. In India, their view of reality, what is the nature of reality, in it, they claim that living beings cannot die, right? They say, well, it's only the body that dies. And if the body dies, then the quote-unquote soul reincarnates into a new body, and that's the way they view reality, which means they have a completely different moral, completely different ethics than people that do not believe in such fairy tales, as I would call it. Right? There's no such thing as immortality. Well, they can easily say, well, it's okay to kill somebody because, well, after all, you can't even kill somebody. Right? Okay, continuing. People cannot alter morality, which makes the laws of government devoid of any inherent authority. Right? Ergo, authority, the right to rule, cannot logically exist. Blah, blah. Alright, I don't get that one. The concept itself is a self-contradictory, like the concept of a militant pacifist. A human being cannot have superhuman rights, and therefore no one can have the inherent right to rule. Now that is a good argument. A human being cannot have superhuman rights, and therefore no one can have the inherent right to rule. That's a good argument, strong argument. A person cannot be morally obliged to ignore his own moral judgment. Therefore, no one can have the inherent obligation to obey another. That's also a strong one. And those two ingredients, the ruler's right to command and the subject's obligation to obey, are the heart and soul of the concept of authority, without which it cannot exist. And without authority, there is no government. If the control which the gang called government exerts over others is without legitimacy, it is not government. Its commands are not laws, its enforcers are not law enforcement. Again, without the right to rule and the simultaneous moral obligation to obey on the part of the masses, the organization called government is nothing more than a gang of thugs, thieves and murderers. Government is an impossibility. It's simply not an option, any more than Santa Claus is an option. And insisting that it is necessary when it does not and cannot even exist, or predicting doom and gloom if we do not have the mythical entity, does not change that fact. To argue that human beings need to have a rightful ruler, one with the moral right to forcibly control all others, and one whom all others are obliged to obey, does not change the fact that there is no such thing and can be no such thing. Right? Note from me. I've had this question or argument, right? Not like people having a fight, but with Gino Denning. I was typing to him in an email exchange about the whole idea of money. And I said, well, I made the case that money doesn't exist. I tried to give arguments for that. And he said, well, it may not be real, however, if enough people believe it to be real, then it becomes a reality, right? But then I came up with the term like, well, that's kind of a fake reality then, because so many people believe in it, then apparently money has some value, right? There are still millions and millions and millions of people that believe that the dollar has some value. Therefore, it has some value. I mean, just think about when you listen to other quote-unquote alternative media, right, that have ads, which we don't here, thank you, Jules, that try to sell you gold for your worthless dollars, right? Well, if they were so worthless, why would they give their precious gold for it, right? They think, well, there's a lot of people that still think that the dollar is worth something. And so that makes it real, right? And I would say the same thing here, right? If there are more than enough people that think they need to have a ruler, then, we might think we don't need a ruler, but we are forced to live in such a society because so many people believe in it and make it real for us. Now that's kind of, for me as a philosopher, that's a strange way of using the word real. Continuing. As such, the purpose of this final chapter is not merely to argue that society would work better without the fiction called government, but to introduce the reader the ways in which people will perceive reality differently, think differently, behave differently, and interact differently. Alright, now listen. Again, as a philosopher, I have to jump in here. Let me have a cigarette. he's talking about perceiving and reality and differently, right? So let's grab an example of this. And I'm going to tell you, for as good as I can, for the best that I can, because I'm kind of new to this objectivist philosophy, but I haven't found many things yet that I disagree with. Alright, so here we go. Perceive, reality, and differently. Those are the three words that I'm stumbling upon here. Let's take, for instance, the example of two people, one of them having normal eyes, and one of them being colorblind. Alright? So they both look at a red square, and one says, well, this is a red square. And the colorblind person says, well, this is a gray square. Right? So do they perceive reality differently? One would think so, right? But I don't think this is what Larkin means here. Right? However, there's another thing I want to add to that. So is that a contradiction? Right? So like I said, in reality there are no contradictions. And well, apparently here with the example I gave you, there seems to be a contradiction. One says it's red and the other says it's gray. Right? This is not a contradiction, and I'll explain to you why. For the colorblind person, it is true that the one with normal view sees a red square. For the one with normal view, it is still true that the colorblind person sees a gray square. Right? So both are correct. There is no contradiction here. Right? So keep that in mind. In reality, there are no contradictions. Alright, let's try this again. But to introduce the reader the ways in which people will perceive reality differently. Think differently, behave differently, and interact differently, very differently. Indeed, once they give up the most dangerous superstition, the belief in authority, that's a dot. I should end the sentence there. And this doesn't make, the sentence doesn't flow very well. So I'll just keep on going. Anarchy, meaning an absence of government, is what is. It is what has always been and will always be. Right? How can he claim that? Because having a government is illusionary. Therefore, it is not. When people accept that truth and stop hallucinating a creature called authority, they will stop behaving in the irrational and destructive manner they do now. Almost everyone, at least to begin with, has difficulty thinking clearly about such a concept, because every politician and every government is constantly proposing solutions that deal with how society will be organized, managed and controlled through a centralized authoritarian system. Most people do not even know how to mentally process the idea of a complete lack of any forcible imposed system. They instinctively ask things such as, how would the roads work? Or, how would we defend ourselves? The truth is that no one can know everything, how everything would work or what all would happen. Individuals can make suggestions about how things should work, or predictions about how things might work, but no one can possibly know the best way for everything to work. Despite the huge amounts of uncertainty this creates, the historical track record of people living in freedom is far better than any centralized, managed solution has ever been. However, statists have been trained to be terrified of this infinitely more complex type of society, where there is not one master plan, but billions of individuals' plans, interacting with each other in innumerable different ways. To them, that means chaos, and in a way it is chaos, in the sense that there is no single guiding idea and no single controlling entity. This does not mean that people cannot make agreements, or work together, or cooperate and find compromises. Instead, it means that each person will view life as an adult instead of throwing away his free will and responsibility to blindly follow someone else's agenda. As an aside, even without the authority superstition, there would still be leaders and followers. But it would usually be actual leadership, where one person leads by example, by demonstrating a level of intelligence, compassion, or courage which inspires others to behave similarly. That is a very different phenomenon from what is usually dubbed leadership today. When people talk of the leaders of countries, they are talking about people coercively controlling millions of others. The term leader of the free world, when talking about a government official, is inaccurate and self-contradictory. Right? You understand why that's self-contradictory, right? Leader of the free world? That doesn't make any sense. The free world doesn't have any leader. Politicians do not lead by example. No, on the contrary. If anything, they set an example of how to be dishonest, conniving, narcissistic, and power-happy. They say what people want to hear in order to dominate and control them. To call such people leaders is as ridiculous as calling thieves producers, or calling murderers healers. In the absence of the belief in government, real leaders could emerge. People who claim no right to rule, no right to force anyone else to follow them, but whose virtues and actions others recognize as being worth emulating. No one could predict, and no one will control, what all will happen in a world without the myth of government. The following is not therefore intended to be a complete explanation of how every piece of human society would work once the authority myth is gone. Instead, it is an introduction to a few of the ways in which human beings might behave. Let's try this again. It is an introduction to a few of the ways in which human beings might stop allowing an irrational superstition to distort their thinking and pervert their behavior, and might start behaving as rational, free beings, driven by their own free will and individual judgment, as they ought to be. So, next heading, fear of freedom. Most people live their lives surrounded by authoritarian hierarchies. from families, to schools, to businesses, to all levels of government. As a result, most people have a hard time even beginning to imagine a leaderless civilization, a society of equals, an existence devoid of rulers, a world without legislators and their laws. The very thought in most people's minds conjures up images of chaos and mayhem. People are more comfortable with whatever they are accustomed to, and fear the unknown. People are so attached to whatever is familiar to them that even those who live in very high crime areas or war zones rarely leave the world they know to search for something better. Similarly, it is a well-documented fact that some long-term prisoners develop a fear of being released, and when they are, commit further crimes with the intention of being sent back to prison. And when they are, even slaves can exhibit a dread of being freed. This is because the life of a prisoner or a slave, though not likely fulfilling, is predictable, and imagining a new, drastically changed life in a strange place among strangers with all of the related uncertainties, how will I eat, where will I live, what will it be like, will I be safe, scares almost everyone. Yeah. We should get back some of the courage, I guess, that we used to have when we were still hunter-gatherers, right? How do I eat? Where do I sleep? Will the sun rise tomorrow? You know. So it is when most people contemplate human society without a ruling class. The concept is so foreign to everything they have ever known and ever thought about, and everything they were taught is necessary and good, that they hardly know how to begin to imagine it. Even our very language illustrates our fear of living in a society as free equals, because such a state is defined as anarchy, a term also used to describe chaos and destruction. We have grown so accustomed to the mental cage which the myth of authority has formed around each of us, that most of us are terrified of the idea of life without that cage. We are literally scared of our own freedom. And some people work hard to reinforce that fear. Those who benefit the most from the myth of authority, those who crave dominion over others, and the unearned wealth and power it gives them, are constantly pushing the message that life without them in charge would mean constant pain and suffering for everyone. Just about anything people can be afraid of, crime, poverty, disease, invasion, environmental disasters, etc., has been used by tyrants to scare people into subservience. Yes, I would add false flag operations to that list. The details vary, but the template of the message from the tyrants is always the same. If you do not give us power over you, so that we can protect you, you will suffer horribly. That message, combined with man's inherent fear of the unknown, has allowed for an incomprehensible level of oppression, theft, and outright murder, lasting generation after generation all around the world. Ironically, it has been the empty promise of protection against suffering and injustice which has duped so many people into accepting the very thing which has caused more suffering and injustice than in anything else in history, the belief in government. Alright guys, let's see what we can find in YouTube. Poker face. Is this one? Can we use this one? We've heard this before, but this is another live version, I think. I'm gonna take a little break and give you guys a chance to grab a drink or whatever.
This life to pass away. Life presents such possibilities. Every day I heard a calling that was right for me. Pray for strength for what's ahead of me. Show me the high and built the night away. Stood before me was my enemy. He's come to take away my liberties. Rather die than be a slave to thee. Rather than be your slave, I will survive. Can you feel my rage? Got a question of being brave. I'd rather die than be a slave. Didn't matter who shot first that day. They killed my brothers, they lay dead by me. Hit them hard, we made them pay that day. We hung the traitors from the highest trees. Nothing like the pain was heavy. Sacrifice for God and country. Still held the ground that was in front of me. This was the price to pay for liberty. Till you keep me safe. If you feel my rage, not a question. Toys have changed while man has stayed the same. Tribal families rule out over me. I will not let them rape my liberty. We'll die for them today. Rather than be your slave, I will survive.
Thank you, Pokerface. Welcome back, everybody. This is UCY.tv with the Solvinur Event. Welcome everybody in the chat. Del, Hopper, Jules, Road, Vince, Wintermess, Hans, and For Anons. Welcome everybody. So let's pick this up where we left off. Blah, blah, blah. Move this there. Click that, and there we go. It seems strange that any thinking human being would not be naturally open and receptive to the idea that he owns himself and should be in charge of his own life, unhindered by any human authority. However, the average person who hears such a message often lashes out at the messenger, insists that actual freedom, a world without masters and subjects, would mean chaos and destruction, and then vehemently advocates the continued enslavement of all of mankind, including himself. He does so not based upon any rational thought or any evidence or experience, but based on his own deep-seated existential terror of the unknown. The unknown in this case being a society of equals instead of masters and subjects. He has never seen it in action on a large scale and has never thought about it, cannot imagine it and therefore fears it. And those who desire dominion over others are constantly reinforcing and encouraging that fear in those they seek to subjugate. Which brings us to the next heading, which is called Seeing a Different World. When someone who has been indoctrinated into the cult of authority finally disentangles himself from the superstition, the first thing that happens is that he sees a drastically different reality. Yes. I might add here. Do I want to add that? Yeah. Alright, I want to add this. He may see a different reality, but that doesn't mean that reality has actually changed. Right? What do I mean with that? A subjectivist view would say, however you perceive reality, that is what it is. And then they go on saying that it's an illusion because they claim that our senses, right, that are not reliable, right? Kant is a master of contradictions in that sense. And the thing is that the way with which you use your senses, the interpretation you give to the information that you receive with your senses does not create reality. Right? Reality is what it is, regardless of how you look at it. What kind of smokes am I smoking? This is called Ruba. Ruba. Type it in the chat for you. In Dutch we call it heavy tobacco. Yeah, I don't know why they call it heavy, but yeah. Now it's we can buy different packages now. They all used to be 50 grams. Now you can choose if you want 40 grams or 50 grams. And that's just the tobacco, and so you get leaves with that. Risla. I use Risla leaves. Thank you, Harper. Yeah. And then you roll your cigarette, and you can light it up. It's become pretty expensive. This one costs €5.80. You get about 45 cigarettes out of that. It used to be under 5 guilders, which is like €2 or something. And that's not that long ago. Prices of tobacco have skyrocketed. Alright, so keep that in mind. Reality is what it is, regardless of how you look at it. Regardless of your consciousness. When he observes the effect of authority superstition, which infiltrate nearly every aspect of most people's lives. Yeah, drum is also a... Sorry to interrupt again this reading because of the chat, but... I used to smoke that in the past when I was like 18, 19, 20. Yeah. And it hasn't killed me yet. I've been smoking for, what is it now, 35 years or so? They say smoking kills, right? Yeah. Alright, let's try this. When he observes the effect of the authority superstition, which infiltrate nearly every aspect of most people's lives, he sees things as they actually are, not as he has formerly imagined them to be. Huh? What do you mean he sees things as they actually are? If he's looking at these people that are under the effect of authority. I don't get this sentence, might be just me, you know. Most of the time when he sees so-called law enforcement in action, he recognizes it as raw, illegitimate and immoral thuggery. Yes, right? Being used to extort and control the people in order to serve the will of the politicians. Whereas a statist might view them as heroes, you know? The exception to this is when the police use force to stop others who are actually guilty of acts of aggression. Ironically, the very acts which the police routinely commit for the ruling class. When the recovering statists watches various political rituals, whether a presidential election, a legislative debate in Congress, or a local zoning board passing some new ordinance, he sees it for what it is, the acting out of delusions and hallucinations by people who have been indoctrinated into a completely irrational cult. Any discussion in the media of what public policy should be or which representatives should be elected or what legislation should be enacted appear to one who has escaped the superstition as useful as and rational as well-dressed, attractive, respectable-looking people seriously discussing how Santa Claus should handle the next Christmas. To one who has escaped the myth of authority, the premise upon which all political discussion rests disintegrates, and every bit of the rhetoric which stems from the superstition is recognized as being utterly insane. The unindoctrinated individual sees every campaign speech, every political argument, every discussion in the news about anything political, every CNN broadcast of another debate on the House floor over some new piece of legislation as a display of the symptoms of profound delusion due to the blind acceptance of utterly asinine cult-like dogma. All voting, campaigning, writing to one's congressmen, signing petitions suddenly appear no more rational or useful than praying to a volcano god to grant its blessing to the tribe. One who has been deprogrammed sees not only the futility in all political action, but sees that such actions, no matter what their intended goals, actually reinforce the superstition. Just as everyone in the tribe praying to a volcano god would reinforce the idea that there is a volcano god, so begging politicians for favors reinforces the idea that there is a rightful ruling class, that their commands are law, and that obedience to such laws is a moral imperative. Those whom most people now regard with great respect and who are often called honorable are recognized as delusional, God-complex lunatics by those who have escaped the authority myth. The unindoctrinated would take no more pride in shaking the president's hand than he would in shaking the hand of any other psychotic, narcissistic mass murderer. The men who wear black dresses, it's something strange, right? Men wearing dresses. The men who wear black dresses and wield wooden hammers and refer to themselves as the court are seen as the madmen they are. Those who wear badges and uniforms and imagine themselves to be something other than mere human beings are not seen by the deprogrammed as noble warriors for law and order, but as confused souls suffering from what is little more than a mental disorder. Of course, those who have given up the superstition of authority can still fear the damage which the megalomaniacs and their mercenary soldiers and police are capable of inflicting. But the mercenaries' actions are no longer seen as being in any way legitimate, or rational, or moral. Those who have escaped the myth begin to see that those whose actions are influenced by their official badge are as dangerous as people who are high on PCP, and for the same reason, because they are hallucinating a reality which is not there. Right? That's another very strong point. They are hallucinating a reality which is not there. In other words, they are living in illusion, right? Which leads them to act out violently, unrestrained by a rational thought process. Those who have escaped the authority superstition when confronted by a police officer may still act as they would if controlled by a rabid dog, speaking softly, behaving in a submissive manner, and not making sudden movements. But it is not out of respect for either the law enforcer or a rabid dog, it is out of fear of the danger posed by a brain that is malfunctioning because it is infected by a destructive disease, be it rabies or the belief in authority. Right, that's a good one, right? Last one. When believers in authority commit acts of aggression, imagining such acts to be righteous because they are called law, their targets have few options. When a tax collector or a police officer or some other enforcer of the will of politicians attempts to extort, harass, control, or assault those who have escaped the myth of authority, the targets of the legal aggression can either go along with what they know to be injustice, or they can try to somehow circumvent or hide from the legal aggressors. or they can forcibly resist the aggressors. It is unfortunate that the last option is ever necessary, because, though using defensive force is morally justified, even when illegal, it is sad that one good person would ever have to use violence against another good person simply because the latter has had his perception of right and wrong twisted. Yeah. Again, that word perception, right? I would say has had his interpretation of right and wrong twisted and perverted by an irrational superstition. Even the murderous thugs of the most brutal regimes in history, due to their faith in the authority myth, thought they were doing their duty. They thought, on some level, that their actions were noble and righteous, or they would not have committed them. Such mindless loyalty to authority often leaves the intended victims with only two options: submit to tyranny or kill the deluded law enforcer. It would be far better for everyone if, before forcibly resistance becomes necessary, the mercenaries of the state could be deprogrammed out of their delusion, so as to avoid the necessity of having to scare, hurt, or even kill them to stop them from committing evil. Alright, here's another personal note from the author. The nicest thing I like it when he uses the word author's personal note, right? Using authority, why not a writer's personal note? The nicest thing you can do for anyone who has been duped into acting as a pawn of the oppression machine called government is to do whatever you can do to persuade him to rethink his loyalty to the myth of authority. If all else fails, give him a copy of this book. As uncomfortable as that might be, you might be doing a lot of his potential future victims a huge favor, and you might even be doing the enforcer himself a huge favor by negating the need for one of his future intended victims to maim or kill him. Which brings us to the next heading. A world without rules. Right? So I'm guessing Larkin Rose has made more presentations about natural law. Right? So I'm assuming this heading could just as well have been called A World with Only Natural Law as Rules. One who has been deprogrammed looks out at the world and instead of seeing hierarchies of different ruling classes within different jurisdictions, sees a world of equals, not in talent, ability or wealth, of course, but in rights. He sees a world in which each person owns himself, and he comes to the realization that he has no rightful master, that there is no one above him, and that is true of everyone else as well. Right? The antithesis, true opposite of altruism. He is beholden to no government, no country, and no law. He is a sovereign entity. He is bound by his own conscience and nothing else. Such a realization is incredibly freeing, but also can be quite disturbing to those who have always measured their conduct by how well they obeyed others. Obedience not only is easy as it allows someone else to make all the decisions, but it also allows the one who blindly obeys to imagine that the consequences, whatever they may be, are always someone else's responsibility. To have to figure out right and wrong and to know that you alone are responsible for your decisions and actions can feel like a huge burden. Essentially, losing the belief in authority means growing up, which has advantages and drawbacks. The unindoctrinated person can no longer face the world as carefree, as a carefree, irresponsible child, but at the same time, he will possess a level of freedom and empowerment he could not have imagined before. Statists often have a deep-seated terror of a world in which every person decides for himself what he should do. Unfortunately for them, that is all that has ever existed and all that will ever exist. Everyone already decides for himself what he will do. Yes. And that sounds a bit strange, right? When he just was talking about people obeying, being obedient. Well, you've chosen to be that, right? You've made the decision to be obedient and follow orders. See, everyone already decides for himself what he will do. That is called free will. Many assume that if an individual is not bound by any authority and has the attitude I can do whatever I want, he will behave like a selfish animal. Some even imagine that they themselves would become animals if they were not governed by a master. Right. Pretty low self-esteem, huh? Such a belief implies that people feel a strong moral obligation to do as they are told, but otherwise have no moral compass at all. But most people obey the law because they believe it is good to do so. There is no reason to think that, without being subservient to a master, those same people would no longer care about being good. Good argument. Yet many still imagine human beings to be stupid savages, kept in check only by controllers. So they accept that, if unrestrained by a belief in authority, most people would become like unchained animals. Those who have given up the authority delusion know better. There are, of course, consequences to actions with or without authority. Aside from moral issues, most people usually choose to behave in ways that do not incur the wrath of others. Even if no one believed in right and wrong, being a habitual thief or murderer would be dangerous, and finding ways to peacefully coexist benefits the individual and the group. Excuse me. But aside from that, most people try to be good. In fact, that is why they obey the law, because they were taught that doing so is good. The problem is not that people do not want to be good. It is that their judgment of what good is and what bad is horribly twisted and perverted by the belief in authority. Yes. They are taught that funding and obeying a gang of thugs is a virtue and resisting is a sin. They are taught that asking those thugs to rob and control their neighbors via legislation is perfectly moral and legitimate. In short, when it comes to authority, they are taught that good is evil and evil is good. Initiating violence via the law is seen as good, and resisting such assaults, breaking the law, is seen as bad. Without the myth of authority, people would still have disagreements, and some would still be malicious or negligent, and would still do stupid or hostile things. The main difference is in how human beings would interact without the authority, superstition, is quite simple. If someone did not feel justified in doing something himself, he would not feel justified in asking someone else to do it, nor would he feel justified doing it himself on someone else's behalf. The concept is so simple, almost to the point of sounding trivial, but would lead to a huge change in human behavior. To wit, if someone would not feel justified in paying for his children's education by forcibly robbing his neighbors, he also would not feel justified in voting for local government to impose a property tax to pay for public schools. And if someone would not feel justified in stealing his neighbor's property to fund a school, he would not feel justified in doing so even if he was given a badge and told to do so in the name of the law. As another example, if someone would not feel justified in kicking down someone's door and dragging him away and putting him in a cage for years for having possessed a plant with mind-altering properties, then he would not feel justified in supporting anti-drug laws either. Nor would he suddenly feel justified in engaging in such trespassing, assault and kidnapping just because some authority gave him a badge and told him to do so in the name of some law. As yet another example, if someone would not feel justified using violence to keep a complete stranger from setting foot anywhere in an entire country, then he would still not feel justified in doing so if someone gave him a badge, nor would he feel justified in supporting immigration laws which instruct others to do so. In a society without the myth of authority, there would still be thieves, murderers, and other aggressors. The difference is that all of the people who view theft and murder as immoral would not advocate and condone legal theft and murder, which every statist now does. Again, to advocate any law is to advocate the use of whatever level of authoritarian force is required, up to and including deadly force, to achieve compliance. And the people who perceived theft and murder as immoral would not commit such acts simply because some authority or law told them to. How much of what police do on a daily basis would they do on their own, without a law or government telling them to? Very little. How much of what soldiers routinely do would they do on their own, without an authoritarian military leader telling them to? How much of what tax collectors do now would they do on their own, without any government telling them to? Everything good that the people who are called law enforcers now do, trying to stop genuinely hostile, destructive people from harming innocents, they could continue to do without the myth of authority, and they could do so out of the kindness of their hearts, or as a paid career, in the unlikely event that other people would want to voluntarily pay them for doing so. Did I say unlikely? It says likely. At the same time, everything bad that law enforcers and soldiers do now, like terrorizing or shooting people they know nothing about, aggressing against those who commit victimless crimes, detaining, interrogating and assaulting complete strangers, most of them would stop doing. How many people were assaulted, tortured and murdered by the population of Germany as a whole, or by the population of Russia as a whole, or the population of China as a whole, before the respective governments of those countries, under the regimes of Hitler, Stalin and Mao, enacted laws pretending to legitimize such atrocities? Almost none. And how many atrocities were committed after authority issued commands directing people to commit them? Yeah, Wintermess says it's a funny thing with a law. It says to killing people is bad, but if the person did something wrong, then in the name of the law it is good to execute this person. That's a contradiction. You pointed that out very well. Not because he did something horrible, but he just breaks the law. Yes, Very well put, Wintermess, indeed. The numbers are staggering. Tens of millions murdered, hundreds of millions assaulted, oppressed or tortured. Obviously, the people of those countries, and just about every other country, were far less inclined to commit acts of aggression on their own than they were to commit acts of aggression when commanded to do so by an imagined authority. Okay, let me have a drink. Hopper also agrees with you. Yeah. Ironically, when faced with the concept of a purely voluntary society in which every service, even defense and protection, is funded by willing customers instead of by coercive taxation, many statists predict that private security firms would evolve into new, abusive, oppressive governments, or that competing security companies would end up being engaged in perpetual violent conflicts with each other. Such predictions fail to recognize that most people do not want to attack and rob their neighbors, and do not want to be attacked and robbed themselves. And it is only through the belief in authority that the majority ever feels okay about advocating robbery via taxation, or ever feels obligated to go along with being attacked and robbed themselves via obeying the law. Without the notion that government has rights that individuals do not, no malicious, aggressive private security firm would ever have popular support. If they were seen merely as private employees of average people, no one involved, neither the customer nor their hired protectors, would imagine the employees to have any right to steal, harass, terrorize, or do anything that anyone else does not have the right to do. To look at it another way, and to make it more personal, imagine living in a world where none of your neighbors felt justified in advocating that you be taxed to fund things you object to. Imagine if every cause, every plan, every program, every idea, every proposed solution to all sorts of problems was something you could either voluntarily support or not. Imagine living in a world where none of your neighbors felt that they had the right to forcibly impose their ideas, choices and lifestyles upon you. They would feel justified, as they do already, in using force to stop you if you decided to attack them or rob them, but very few would feel good about committing any sort of aggression against you. Contrary to what most people assume, this is exactly what a world without rules would look like. Each person would be guided by his own conscience, which could be thought of as self-imposed rules or self-government, and even though some people acting on their own would still make stupid or malicious choices and commit acts of aggression, no longer would anyone imagine that calling something a law or a rule can make inherently unjustified act into something good. I hope I'm not confusing two people here, but I think I saw Larkin Rose, the writer of this book, also in a video where he explained some of the things that happen in societies that are far off from this Western world. They are living in the wilderness, for instance, right? Small villages. He explained how the children are raised there. And he said that they are taught values of how do I finish this sentence? Maybe I should start over. They are taught to live a moral life, right? And if they act immorally when they are children, they are told, well, you cannot do this. You can't steal. This is immoral, right? And then at a certain point, when they deem the child to be grown up, and this person is still stealing, they're just kicking him out of the village. You just ban him. Go out in the wilderness and don't come back. And if you do come back, we will forcibly eject you from the village, if not kill you, right? That's the message he gets. If you are not behaving morally. And if you were to resist such an act of aggression, your neighbors would praise you for doing so, instead of condemning you as a criminal, which nearly all of them would today if you resisted an act of aggression which happens to be legal. Alright, that brings us to the next heading, which is called Thinking Differently, Talking Differently. Many of the terms people use and the discussion they have on a daily basis are based on the assumption that authority can exist. By constantly hearing and repeating the superstition-based dogma, nearly everyone unwittingly reinforces the myth in their own minds and in the minds of those they talk to. Authoritarian propaganda is so ubiquitous that it does not feel to the masses like a message at all. It just feels like talking about what is. Most of every history book is about who ruled, what area, when, which authoritarian regime conquered another authoritarian regime, which individuals or political parties came to power, which forms of government and type of public policy various empires have had, and so on. They speak about elections, who wielded the power behind the scenes. Oh, that's interesting. I actually kind of missed that. They speak about elections, who wielded the power behind the scenes. They never told me that. What laws were passed, what taxes were imposed, and what the people thought about their leaders. Yeah. The underlying premise, which comes through loud and clear, even if it is never openly stated, is that it is both inevitable and legitimate for there to be a ruling class. Some variety of overlord with the right to forcibly control everyone else. That message continues to be a constant underlying theme of nearly everything written in the newspapers or broadcast on the radio or television. The news reports, whether local or national, talk about what legislation the representatives or congressmen have passed, what law enforcers did that day, what candidates are running for public office, what public policies they support, and so on. The way every bit of it is reported is heavily tainted by the superstition of authority. Of course, the way people think affects the way they talk, and each person is constantly expressing his fundamental beliefs, even in seemingly trivial discussions. Compare how the same exact situation and events would likely be reported, first by one who believes in authority, and then by one who does not. Alright, so here comes with superstition. Today, the local government of Springfield put into place a 4% increase in local building permit fees, the proceeds of which are intended to fund a program to provide certain medical assistances for the elderly. Alright, now without superstition. Today, a group of local extortionists issued a formal threat to anyone doing construction or renovation in Springfield, demanding 4% more than the group had previously demanded from such people. The thieves say they intend to give some of the money they seize to the elderly. Right? When someone escapes the superstition of authority, his thought patterns and therefore his speech patterns change dramatically. He does not use the euphemistic terms which assign legitimacy to legal violence. He describes tax collectors as what they actually are, professional extortionists. He describes law enforcers as what they actually are, the politicians' hired thugs. He describes laws as what they actually are, threats from politicians. He does not proudly describe himself as a law-abiding taxpayer because he recognizes what that term actually means, one who allows himself to be robbed and controlled by power-hungry megalomaniacs. Most statists have a hard time imagining a world in which there is no centralized machine attempting to control everyone else. However, some find it equally difficult imagining a world in which they themselves are not being forcibly controlled. The thought of looking out at the world and feeling beholden to no one, feeling no obligation to obey the laws of others, is utterly foreign to anything they have ever contemplated. As sad as it is, many people find it very hard to even imagine a world in which there is no one they must bow to, no legislature they must subjugate themselves to, no law or rule that can ever outrank their own consciousness. Such ideas are worlds away from what nearly everyone has been taught to believe, and accepting such a drastically different view of reality feels like a profound existential awakening. He who has escaped the myth says to himself something like this. Excuse me. Does any person or any group of people have the right to demand payment from me for something I did not ask for and do not want to fund? Of course not. If I am not committing aggression against anyone via force or fraud, does anyone have the right to force me to make the choices they wish I should make? I don't get that one. Let's try and read this again. If I am not committing aggression against anyone via force or fraud, does anyone have the right to force me to make the choices they wish I would make? Okay, of course not. Do I have the right to resist such aggression? Of course. Does any person or any group of people possess any rights that I do not possess? No. How and from where would they have gotten such rights? Good question. Do I, at any time or in any place, under any circumstances, ever have an obligation to do anything other than what my own conscience dictates? This is a very good question also. If you go against your own conscience, you are basically betraying yourself, right? Is there any situation in which the decrees or laws of any supposed authority could ever obligate me in any way or to any degree to abandon my free will or ignore my own sense of right and wrong? Of course not. And that brings us to the next heading. Teaching morality versus teaching authority. It is commonly held that unless children are taught to respect and obey authority, They will be like wild animals, stealing, assaulting, and so on. But being obedient in and of itself merely means that instead of the individual using his own judgment, he will defer to the judgment of those who seek and acquire positions of power. Some of the most immoral, corrupt, callous, malicious, dishonest people on earth. Training people to be merely obedient only prevents animalistic behavior if the supposed authority does not itself condone and command theft and assault, as every government in history has done in the name of taxation and law enforcement. Obviously, teaching obedience does not help civilization if those giving orders are commanding the very behaviors that harm society. Acts of aggressions against innocence. The idea that widespread subservience is good for society rests upon the patently false assumption that people in positions of power are morally superior to everyone else. Right? Another very good point. It should be self-evident that having most people disregard their own consciences, instead entrusting politicians to make their choices for them, is not going to make society any safer or more virtuous. Instead, it will simply legitimize the very acts that interfere with peaceful human coexistence. Consider the analogy of a robot, which is programmed to do whatever its owner tells it to do, whether productive or destructive, whether civilized or aggressive. This is akin to a child learning to respect authority. Whether the obedient robot or child ends up being a tool for destruction and oppression depends entirely upon who ends up giving the orders. If instead children are taught the principle of self-ownership, the idea that every individual belongs to himself and therefore should not be robbed, threatened, assaulted or murdered, then the supposed virtue of obedience is complete unnecessary. Consider which of the following is more likely to lead to a just, peaceful society. Billions of people being taught the basic of how to be moral human beings, principle of non-aggression, or billions of people being taught merely to obey in the hopes that the few people who end up in charge will happen to give good orders. If there is any difficulty imagining what would happen in the two scenarios, one need only look to history to see what has happened. It's 58, guys. My tune is gonna kick in soon. So I want to thank everybody in the chat for showing up. Dale, Hopper, Jules, Road, Winter, Mess, and Tuanons still there in the chat that I've managed to not scare away. Thanks all for listening. Next week we will continue this. We might be able to finish it then. I'm not sure. We still got a few things to go here. We are at page 157 of 200.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
That's it for this call.
Inherently and historically.
Thanks everybody.
Societies.
Take care. See you next week.
And the secret proceedings.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific